A full year after my father died, I finally accepted his death and began cleaning out the house where he spent nearly every day of his life. It was a small cabin on a lake overlooking the sunrise every morning, where he often did his best work as a novelist, asking questions about other people's lives and unraveling the answers at inconvenient times. He became a minimalist after my mother died when I was young, but he kept one item: our lush, olive green couch. Most nights he would sit with me and read stories aloud. It was our way of connecting, of learning about other people's lives while creating our own, one page at a time. I'd known my father to have few hobbies, with the exception of writing. He had published his most popular book years before I was born, but he continued to write long after its success. Though he rarely mentioned it, no subsequent book achieved the same level of prominence. The award-winning story revolved around a man with a secret. That man lived alone in the middle of a mountain range in the Rockies, only speaking with the occasional neighbor who happened to walk too far and pass by his house. The man's secret, revealed early in the novel, was that he fathered a child in his late teens, only to abandon him because he was born with multiple deformities. He was embarrassed, and he doubted his ability to care for a child who would require his undivided attention for the rest of his life. The boy's mother, who was not married to the man at the time, died while giving birth. The child's only family was his father, who left just a day after his birth. The story, told over several decades, is a gradual admission of guilt. The man describes in painstaking detail the sadness he felt for years after leaving his son in the hospital. Sadness manifested itself in the form of countless nights at home in bed, frequently waking up in the middle of the night to count the rotations of the ceiling fan with each turn. Sadness drove him from counting rotations to long, drawn-out walks hours before sunrise. It was horrifying to read about how this child suffered at his most vulnerable stage, only to be abandoned by the one person who was supposed to protect him. I'd always wondered where my father's cruel and cold emotions came from, and how I could channel them into a character. My father was such a generous man with so few possessions that I was surprised he hadn't given away his house at some point. However, when I asked him about the source of his creativity, he simply shrugged. "It's amazing what the subconscious can deliver," he once told me. Looking through the attic of his lifelong home, my childhood home, I discovered a ragged box in the back of his office's small closet. When I opened the box, a plume of dust rose into the air. It had an old and mildewy odor. I recognized the two books sitting on top, both worn from repeated readings and covered in dust. As I opened the first one's flap, I noticed a short note scribbled inside, signed by an author my father had repeatedly mentioned to me. It was a kind note, clearly intended only for him to see. I put it down and opened a few others. Every one of them had personal inscriptions for my father, such as, "Enormously grateful for your writing, and you convey emotion like no one else." I finished removing the books and picked up the last item at the bottom, a small gift-wrapped box. An unsealed envelope addressed to me was taped onto it. "My son, I have enclosed the story of my life. It's the story of my life before you were born, before so many things changed. I intended to publish this memoir as soon as I finished writing it, but the universe had other plans. You emerged, a smiling ball of perfection. I shelved the manuscript and informed my publisher that I would only submit it after my death. The words in this book will be painful to read, but I owe it to my readers, particularly you, to put them in print. Please send this copy to Richie, he'll know what to do. With all of my love, Dad." Richie was my father's longtime friend and literary agent. Richie became fast friends with my father after he was named editor of the high school yearbook and asked him to write the foreword to their senior edition. When Richie moved to New York City after college and started working in publishing, he approached my father about writing a story about his high school years. "We can call it fiction," he had stated. "This would make your career." That is the story that became a bestseller. After I sent Richie the manuscript of my father's final piece of work, he unexpectedly showed up at my apartment one afternoon with a dreadful expression on his face, his eyes drooping and dark circles under them. He looked like he hadn't slept for a week. I'd seen that look on my father once before, when I asked him how he came to express the emotions he did in his first novel. "Did your father ever talk to you about his time before meeting your mother?" Richie asked me. The question was unsettling, much like a teacher questioning whether you were the author of your book report. My father had briefly spoken with me about his previous life and how he had made his fair share of mistakes, as he called them. I wasn't sure if he was referring to my father's occasional drunk driving after high school or something else entirely. "But did he ever talk to you about his indiscretions?" Richie asked. "Indiscretions are not something I would accuse my father of. He was devoted to my mother from their early years together until her death." But then I remembered that Richie started this conversation before my father and mother met. "Your father's memoir that you sent me, it's a detailed account of his biggest regrets," said Richie. "Your father struggled a lot back then. He struggled every day of his life." I watched Richie's expression shift from discussing a book to discussing the details of my father's life before he became the man I knew him to be. Richie started telling me about Julia, a woman my father met during his junior year of high school. The two were inseparable, he explained, to the point where one never appeared without the other. They were always together, whether at football games or church on Sundays. And then one morning a few weeks after a party, she told him that she was pregnant. He was devastated. He wasn't ready for a child, but he had a whole plan for his life. "Wait, I have a half-brother," I asked. Richie didn't answer. He just motioned awkwardly with his hands that he had more to say. "When the baby was born," Richie continued, "he had many problems, or rather setbacks. He was blind, and both of his feet were conjoined. His spine was also shaped in a way that prevented him from standing up straight. Your father was distraught. Remember, he wasn't even 18 yet." This story Richie was telling, it was similar to the novel, but I couldn't imagine my father abandoning a child. He and I were very close growing up. "When the doctors took the baby to see what they could do to help him," Richie explained, "his mother's heart stopped. It was like without the baby, she couldn't survive. The doctors did everything they could, but she died in the same spot where she gave birth." This was the novel. My father didn't write a work of fiction. He wrote his own life story and called it fiction. I looked at Richie like I'd never seen him before, a man I practically called an uncle. Now he seemed a stranger to me. My father had another child, and he abandoned him. I have a half-brother, and no one said anything to me the entire time. My father lied, and Richie lied to me. Richie watched me process what he had just said. I had so many questions about the baby, about Julia, about where her parents were and why they weren't involved. Richie could tell I was spiraling. "You don't have a half-brother," he replied. My mind stopped, like Richie had reached over and hit pause on my temple. "I didn't know this until I read what you sent me, but your father discovered the child wasn't his. Some years after the baby's birth, DNA samples collected for a genealogy website matched results from a national database of adopted children. The child belonged to someone else, but your father never found out who," Richie explained. He started to cry. Though I was still lost in my confusion, Richie was visibly upset that my father had spent the majority of his life feeling guilty for abandoning a child who wasn't even his. Richie was a good friend to my father, and he had apparently consoled him over the years, allowing him to channel his sadness and frustration into his novels. Through tears now streaming down his face, Richie looked directly into my eyes and admitted what he'd bottled up for decades. "The baby was mine," he said. Richie began to explain, but I could not hear him. I was trying to wrap my mind around the lie that had stretched a lifetime. I tried to piece together this puzzle, this never-ending question that had plagued my father for so many years, but all I could think about was how my father's best friend, the man he trusted the most in his life, had lied to him about everything. Richie mentioned a night at a party, a mistake, a one-time occurrence, an excuse for finding out later and protecting my father. But everything I heard was betrayal. I didn't care about the cowardice in his voice or how he tried to ease his conscience. The fiction was too real. I took the book from Richie's hands and told him to leave. He didn't hesitate and nearly handed me the book. He tried to apologize again, but he could tell from the look on my face that he'd failed. I didn't want to hear what else he had to say. Richie left, and I locked the door, staring at the back as if the answers to all the questions I just formulated were written on it, waiting for me to begin reading. I walked over to my couch, where my father and I had shared many stories, and sat down. I opened his memoir, the only one of his that I hadn't yet read, and began my search for answers.